Check, check, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, come on in. If you're in the hall and you can hear this, we're going to start up here in about 1 minute. You guys balance out that donut with a Chick-fil-A sandwich? Can't beat it. All right, let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned earlier, we seem to be in this interesting cultural moment where there's at least renewed interest in questions about the existence of God. Now, why might this be surprising? Let me take you back and give some context to this. You go back to 1966. Time magazine had an iconic cover that asked the question, is God dead? There were generations of scholars coming out of the Holocaust on what's called the Death of God movement, and really had written God off. Fast forward a few years to the first decade or so of the 2000s, and you have this group of atheists somewhat dominating and controlling the public conversation about God called the New Atheists. Individuals like Christopher Hitchens, who's passed away, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. If you don't recall their verbiage, let me remind you of something Christopher Hitchens said. Religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. We've also seen, since the 90s, this rise of what's called the nones. So less and less people identifying themselves through the lens of religion and identifying themselves as a none, N-O-N-E. So a lot of people have concluded that God is out of a job. But it seems to me this is not the whole story. I think the God conversation has shifted a little bit. Gone are the days of the New Atheists saying, like Christopher Hitchens' book, religion poisons everything. And now we have people like Jordan Peterson, who wrote a book called We Who Wrestle with God, who's been a huge spokesman for Gen Z. And he says the Bible is the story on which Western civilization is predicated. This positive view and this recognition of what the Bible has contributed to Western civilization, and that there's some goodness behind it. About 6 weeks ago, I had on a scholar by the name of Charles Murray. You might recognize his name. Written some mega New York Times best-selling books. Harvard, MIT, as secular as it gets. And he wrote a book that just came out called Taking Religion Seriously. He describes himself as kind of an eccentric Christian. He's not quite to Orthodox Christianity. He's so close. We had a remarkable conversation about this. But my question is like, who's the next celebrity? Who's the next scholar that's going to be coming out and talking about how this God conversation matters? Now, second, we've actually seen some high-profile conversions. We've seen a number of people who have very much been antagonistic to the Christian faith and God shifting. So one prominent one was Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She grew up with a radical Muslim background and then became one of the New Atheists. And then in 2023, in November, so about 2 years and a few months ago, she wrote an article talking about why she now believes in God, why I'm now a Christian. She says there's a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. So not only is the conversation shifting, but we seem to see these conversions taking place regularly. And third, there's a growing awareness of the failure of secularism. There's a growing awareness of the need for something spiritual, something beyond this world. So I read the New York Times almost every morning, in part because I want to know. I don't just read news sources that I tend to agree with. I'll watch some of Fox News. I like Bret Baier, and I read the New York Times to get different perspectives. Well, one of the columnists, one of the very few, maybe the only one who's truly conservative, is a Catholic, Ross Douthat. And he wrote a book that came out last year called Believe. And he talks about how mystery and magic and enchantment seem to be pushing back into the world. His point is, when he started at the New York Times about 15 years ago, there was much more pushback and less interest in spiritual things. But now there's an openness. Now there seems to be an interest in the conversation that he hadn't seen before. Rod Dreher, Greek Orthodox writer, he wrote a book recently called Living in Wonder. And he argues that there's this fascination with UFOs. They're like everywhere now. And psychedelics are back. I predict that in a matter of time, psychedelics will go through a similar route as marijuana, used medically, and then probably be pushed towards increasing legalization and use. But part of the fascination with psychedelics is this spiritual yearning that people have. It connects us to another world. And of course, one piece of the conversation that happened 4 months ago was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now we disagree with somebody, we shoot him and we kill him, and people are gleeful about it. And yet we've probably all heard stories of like, wait a minute, people being jarred to think about life because of this polarized, divided, angry cultural moment that we're at. Well, if there is a renewed interest in God, and I think there seems to be, none of this should surprise us. Because Psalms 19, David wrote 3,000 years ago, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies above proclaim his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. I'm going to walk us through 7 evidences that God is back, and they all started around the middle of the 20th century and then grew during the age when people were saying God is dead, God's out of a job. I think the evidence has actually been getting stronger during that time. Evidence number 1, the beginning of the universe. The beginning of the universe. There's an old joke of some scientists who come to God and say, God, we can do everything that you can do. God says, like what? He says, well, we can make life from non-life. God says, wow, show me. Scientists reach down and grab some dust, and God says, wait a minute, get your own dust. Where'd that dust come from? Stars? Where'd that come from? Quantum fluctuations? Where did everything come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, Antony Flew, you may recognize his name. For 5 decades, the latter part of the 20th century, he was perhaps the most influential atheist, certainly most influential philosophical atheist. And he argued, in fact, before C.S. Lewis at Oxford back in the 50s, why the idea of God is meaningless. Well, he died in 2010. In 2007, he published a surprising book. And the book is titled, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now, why would this atheist change his mind? He said, when I first met the Big Bang Theory as an atheist, it seemed to me the theory made a big difference because it suggested that the universe had a beginning, and that the first sentence in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, was related to an event in the universe. As long as the universe could be comfortably thought to be not only without end, but also without beginning, it remained easy to see its existence as brute facts. If there had been no reason to think the universe had a beginning, there would be no reason to postulate something else that produced the whole thing. But the Big Bang Theory changed all that. If the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning. He's right. Up until the middle of the 20th century, scientists used to think that the universe was eternal and didn't have a beginning. And then through a range of different discoveries that coalesced along the same lines, scientists now, the vast majority, say the universe had a beginning itself. So here's how the simple argument goes. Number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. If something begins to exist, there's a reason it begins to exist. Things don't come into existence or start uncaused. Now, we don't see uncaused things happening. We don't see horses popping into existence. And it's also obviously common sense and intuitive that whatever begins to exist has a cause. But second, the universe began to exist. Now, there's been biblical arguments, Genesis 1. There's been philosophical arguments. But in the 20th century, we see this emergence and recognition that, wait a minute, the universe hasn't existed for always. It goes back to a point where there's actually a cosmic beginning to the universe itself. What follows from this? Therefore, the universe had a cause. So when I asked the atheist story about reality, a few of you shouted out, Big Bang. Look, I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. Big Bang was a term coined by Frederick Hoyle, who's an agnostic, to describe that the universe seemed to explode into existence at a finite point in the past. If that's correct, it raises the question of why that happened, where that came from, and what a sufficient cause would be. So if the universe has a cause, then it raises the question, what cause must that be like? Well, the universe is physical, so the cause is not physical. The cause must be really powerful. With the universe, we have time beginning, so the cause must be timeless, must be spaceless, must be immaterial. This is starting to sound a lot like God. You might say the beginning of the universe points to a beginner. But there's a second evidence that points towards God. It's what's called the fine-tuning of the universe. Now imagine you come visit me in Southern California. I live in a little town called San Juan Capistrano. And there's some undeveloped hills back kind of behind where I live. And we go walk and we come across a cabin that looks like this. And you're like, oh, interesting, let's go explore. As you walk up, you hear something strange. It's the sound of your favorite song in the background. Beat It by Michael Jackson. You ignore the obvious warning and decide to come in anyways. You open up that little broken door and you see shoes that fit you perfectly, a jacket exactly your size, the books you like to read on the counter. There's a small fridge and it's the exact snacks you munch on, a small bathroom, and it's the precise toiletries you use. Now, what would you suspect? Besides thinking you're in a horror film, at some point you would stop and go, okay, wait a minute. This is arranged too precisely for me. This can't be coincidence. Someone is expecting my arrival. Now, what's interesting, in some ways, this cabin illustration is what we've discovered about the universe as a whole. So Freeman Dyson, a well-accomplished scientist, he said, as we look out in the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. So there's something that are called the constants or laws of physics, such as the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the cosmological constant, the strength of gravity, where if these varied even slightly, the universe as a whole would not be hospitable to life. So it's kind of like, it's like these parameters exist. Remember an old radio where you'd have a radio and you're trying to dial, like to get it just right tuned, a little to the left and the right, and it's out? It's almost like these laws have to be fine-tuned. But it's not one dial. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of set precisely where they need to be to have a universe capable of supporting life starts to suggest that somebody is tinkering with this. It's like life exists on a razor's edge that slides to the left or the right, and the entire universe becomes inhospitable. It's like Goldilocks. That's too hot, that's too cold, just right. We're in a just right universe. So again, Frederick Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang, he said it almost seems as if someone has been monkeying with physics. Now, the numbers behind this are really astounding and almost impossible to really grasp how precise this is. But if you take the odds of two of them being fine-tuned, cosmological constant and gravity, what are the odds that these two of dozens of parameters that have to be set would be fine-tuned? Well, the odds are 1 in 100 million, trillion, 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 trillion. That's a big number. If you can't grasp it, just think of our new national debt. I actually saw a tweet this week that is like our national debt is now 32 or 35 trillion dollars. That's insane. That's insane. But that is two examples of the dozens that need to be fine-tuned precisely for life. I would argue a fine-tuning points towards a cosmic fine-tuner. Beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. The fine-tuning points towards a fine-tuner. The third is the origin of life. The more we've discovered about the origin of life, the more you could argue we see the fingerprints of a creator. So Antony Flew, again, the former atheist I mentioned before, asked an interesting question. He said, how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? What a great question. How do you get from laws of physics and inanimate matter to living matter? Well, in the average adult human body, you have 30 trillion cells. 30 trillion cells. Each of the cells has a strand of DNA within it. If you took that DNA out and uncoiled it, it would be about 6 feet in length. That means if you took all the DNA in your body and strung it together, it would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. Is that incredible to just let sink in? Well, DNA stores information. According to one estimate, each cell has the equivalent of 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. One strand of DNA has that amount of information. Now, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, made a very interesting observation. He said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. He's right. When we have software, we know there's a software engineer. We see information in the cell and in DNA. We ask the question, where did that information come from? What is a sufficient or adequate explanation for that amount of information? By the way, the information in a cell and DNA is far more sophisticated than anything humans can still create today. And yes, that includes with artificial intelligence. Stephen Meyer, Cambridge-trained philosopher of science, he wrote this. He said, whenever we find specified information, we know the causal story of how that information arose. We always find that it arose from an intelligent source. What's his point? Whenever we have information and we're able to trace it to its source, we always find that there's a mind behind it. So if you get a text and it's legible, you'll trace it back to a texter. If you read a blog, you trace it back to a blogger. A book, you trace to an author. You go, well, what about artificial intelligence? Even artificial intelligence was built by human beings with an algorithm to result in that kind of information. Look, during July 4th, I was in Pensacola, Florida. And on July 4th, they were promoting the Fantastic Four movies. And it was kind of a creative advertising for it. Is they had planes going along the whole beach, east and west, and they would stop and they'd do this circle with the number 4 in it. So it was July 4th, promoting Fantastic Four. Everyone's going to see it, ask what it is, and hear about the Fantastic Four movie. Brilliant. Well, nobody looked up and thought, oh my goodness, look at that circled 4. Yeah, a storm is coming over from Georgia. Nobody concluded that. That simple circle with a 4 has the marks of intelligence, and we know didn't happen naturally. And if you come down and visit me, and we go walking on Capo Beach, and you see this sign, John Loves Mary, none of you would stop, and you'd say, you know what? I've heard about the tides on the West Coast, but I had no idea the Pacific, when it goes away, leaves messages in the sand. None of you would attribute it to the crabs. You would know that maybe John wrote it because he loves Mary. Maybe Mary wrote it because she wants to be loved by John. I have no idea. But we know only a mind can explain that. Well, when we look in the natural world in DNA, we don't see the equivalent of a text or a blog or a number 4 or John Loves Mary. We see more sophisticated information than humans are close to creating today. Just as the beginning of the universe points towards the beginner and the fine-tuning points towards a fine-tuner, I would argue that the information in the cell points to an information giver. Fourth, the origin and nature of consciousness. Have you ever stopped and thought, if you're a naturalist or a materialist, where does consciousness, let alone self-consciousness, come from? I invited on an atheist maybe 2 or 3 years ago named Coleman Hughes, a young, libertarian, black atheist, really smart, trained at Columbia University. And we had a conversation about race and a conversation about God. And I asked him a question that I would encourage you to think about asking people. It's a great conversation starter. I said, is there anything about the world, even though you're an atheist, that gives you pause to think there might be a God? Isn't that an interesting question? I've had people say, no, nothing. And then I think, you're not even remotely open to a conversation. Then if somebody gives an answer, then I want to lean in and know what it is about that gives them pause. In his case, he said one thing is consciousness. He goes, as a materialist, there's no explanation, good explanation, of how we become conscious agents that can interact in the world. And I think he's right about that. J.P. Mullen, a colleague of mine at Talbot School of Theology, is one of the top philosophers in the world. He said, for a while, there was, in the philosophical world, the conclusion was there's no soul and materialism, naturalism is true. He said, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st century, things are changing. We're witnessing a resurgence of substance dualism, undergoing an unforeseen revival. Now, substance dualism is the idea that there is mind and there is matter. A human being is body and soul. So naturalists say it's all physical. New Agers and pantheists kind of say it's all spiritual. This fleshly stuff is not real. Christians are like, yeah, there's actually mind and matter. There's body and soul. And we're seeing a resurgence of evidence and interest in this. And I think he's right about that. So I invited on one of the leading skeptics in the world. His name is Michael Shermer. He's best-selling author of a number of books, New York Times selling best author, professor at Chapman. And I invited him to have a conversation, and we ended up going 2 hours debating morality and consciousness. And he believes, interestingly enough, that human beings have free will. A lot of atheists will bite the bullet and say there is no free will, it's all determined by laws in motion, genes, and the physical state of matter. They just bite the bullet. He's like, we have free will. And I'm like, okay, if all is matter in motion, how do we get free will? Where does this come from in a materialist world? And he said, well, at a certain level of complexity, consciousness just emerges. I said, that sounds like the ultimate non-answer to me. Basically, it's magic. He goes, well, think about it. In economic systems, you have things like inflation that just emerge. And the more I thought about it, I was like, inflation is an effect, not a cause. Consciousness is an agent who can act within the world. I'm not even sure if inflation is real. Actually, I take that back. It's very real, isn't it? But you know the point. The effects of it are. We're just describing a phenomenon that happens is not the same as having a soul and acting within the world. Friends, there is no naturalistic explanation at all about how you get life from non-life. And there's no good naturalistic explanation for the origin of consciousness. Yet I would argue human consciousness points towards a cosmic consciousness. If God is a conscious agent, then it would make sense that he would make beings who are conscious. Fifth is the moral law. The moral law. Now, what do I mean by this? In 2010, I had my first public debate with a fellow right there, you can see him on the left, named James Corbett. He's a PhD, and he's in the high school in the same town I'm at. I was at a private Christian school. He's at a public school. And I got an email that said, hey, this guy James Corbett is willing to debate somebody. Would you debate him? Thought about it, prayed about it. I'm like, sure. So we debated at a local junior college whether or not morality is best explained by God or by evolution. Now, what's interesting is I heard, I did my research. I prepped for this like crazy. It's online if you want to watch it and it interests you. But I prepped for this, and I heard him being interviewed on a podcast. And he said, in a few weeks, I'm debating this guy named Sean McDonald. I thought, he can't even get my name right, about whether or not you have to believe in God to be moral. And right away I thought, oh, he doesn't even understand what we're debating. The question is not you have to believe in God to be moral. The question is not you have to believe in God to know right and wrong. Atheists can know right and wrong because they're made in God's image and live in God's world. Atheists can be moral, Christians can be non-moral and evil. That's not the question. The question is, can atheism or naturalism give an adequate grounding for objective moral values and duties? That's the question that we debated, and one I think he was woefully unprepared for. The question is not, can we be good without belief in God? The question is there such a thing as goodness and evil in a universe without God? That's the question. So here's how the argument goes. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So in the absence of God, there's not objective human value, and there's not objective duties we have to one another. Take God out of the picture, and those things are not objectively real. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, said, if there is no God, all is permissible. And I think he's right about that. But second, objective moral values and duties do exist. You say, well, how do you know that? Prove it. Friends, you can't prove that objective moral values and duties exist like you can prove something related to gravity. But we know it intuitively, and it's obvious. William Lane Craig said, if someone doesn't know that torturing a child for fun is wrong, that person doesn't need an argument. They need a therapist. I think he's right about that. So people who press me and say, well, how do you know? I say, okay, let me ask you this way. Do you have any doubt that lying is wrong? Do you actually have any doubt that racism is wrong? Do you actually have any doubt that genocide is wrong? Now, the atheist has one of two options. Either say, no, it's not wrong, and then there's a relativist, and they can't say that anything is wrong, or they say, yes, it's wrong, and have to give a justification or reason why morality is objective without God. And my answer is, good luck with that. So the conclusion is, I didn't show it. So this is I was talking about this yesterday. I wore this shirt in part. The artist of this shirt, sitting right there, Todd McFarlane, is an iconic comic book creator. He created the character Venom. He drew Spider-Man this way in the 90s. We sat down. He also created the character you can see right there, Spawn, who's like a Spawn out of hell, basically. And we sat down in this church, which was kind of fun, for 2.5 hours. And his whole thing was, he looked at me in the eyes. This only happened to me twice. You can see it on film. He kind of leans in, he goes, I will never believe in God. I will never believe in him. And what was his issue? Problem of evil and suffering and hell. Now, I thought of this afterwards and wish I had brought it in then. The problem of evil says there's bad in the world, why doesn't God stop it? God's not doing enough. Hell's the reverse. Oh, there's evil in the world, but God's done too much. You can't say God's not doing enough and at the same time he's done too much. At least pick one and be consistent and go with it. But of course, I thought about that afterwards. But what's so interesting about this is at the beginning of the conversation, he said, I don't think morality is subjective. I think it's relative. And then his whole reason for not believing in God is that God is immoral and unjust and not worthy of worship. Friends, you can't have it both ways. He knows there's right and wrong. We all do. It's written on our hearts. Therefore, God exists. I think the moral law points towards a moral lawgiver. The sixth, we have two more, we'll take questions, is modern day miracles. Modern day miracles. Now, in 2010, Craig Keener, one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world, wrote an academic 2-volume treatise called Miracles. As far as I'm aware, the most exhaustive, careful examination of miracle claims in the past and in the present. And he said across denominations, meant like Catholic and Protestant. You've got Church of Christ, Baptist, EV Free, Pentecostal, you name it. Around the world, across geography, hundreds of millions of Christians believe that they have experienced or witnessed a miracle. He said the kinds of miracle claims frequently attested in the Gospels and Acts are also attested by many eyewitnesses today. The blind receiving sight, the deaf hearing, healings, and even a few cases of people being raised from the dead. Now, in part, you say, okay, what if 99 out of 100 are wrong or lying? You still have millions of people who believe they've seen and experienced miracles alive today. Now, he followed up with a more recent volume, a popular volume called Miracles Today, in which Craig Keener even argues that there's a few cases of miracles that have been caught on film. Now, don't Google miracles caught on film. I'm pretty sure you can't trust it, especially in our age of AI. I think 2025 marked the year where we really can't know with confidence what's true and what's invented. But he documents it very carefully in your books. You can read it, you can study that if you want to. I won't go into any more depth. I find a lot of the cases convincing that he talks about. But let me ask you a question. In a second, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Not yet. And here's the question. If you believe that you have witnessed or experienced a miracle, in a moment, not yet, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Now again, what I don't mean is if you're a fan of the Mavericks and it's like, oh my goodness, we got Cooper Flagg, we got the #1 draft, that's a miracle. Because I'm actually a Spurs fan, so I interpreted that very differently when we got the #2 pick. That's not what I mean. I don't mean like you got an amazing parking spot. I mean something that clearly can't be explained, back to your question, alone by natural causes, points towards the supernatural. If you say, you know what, I have witnessed or experienced a miracle like that, let me see your hands. Put them up. Put them up. Hold them up. Hold them up high. Look around. Maybe a third. Is that fair? At least a third plus? Now, if I had a microphone, I'm tempted to go around and talk to you, but I won't, because here's why. There's always that one guy. You give him a microphone, and if you think, oh, that's not me, that's because it is you. Actually, if you had more time, I would love to hear the stories. An audience this size, there are dozens of you. Everywhere I've gone, every church around the world, different denomination, same response. I would argue that modern day miracles point towards a miracle worker. Now, the ultimate, what time is it? Gauging our clock here. Anybody, one person. If you don't, that's fine. One person willing to stand up and I mean briefly say, here's a miracle that I saw and it's supernatural and you believe it could be confirmed and want to share now, go. I'm going to take a risk. Any one person, just do it. Go ahead, tell us. Tegan. So the two of you witness your little sister paralyzed from the neck down, and she's walking today. Was she prayed over and it was sudden? Give us, I appreciate your quick answer, but quickly give us part two. She's a college student at Tech today. Unbelievable. Incredible. Thank you for sharing that. You can have a seat. That's amazing. Clap for that. You got to respond. Now, of course, skeptics would say, give me the medical proof. And I'd be like, fine. We could go there. But I think modern day miracles point to the existence of a miracle worker. Finally, the ultimate evidence is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, some of you might recognize the name Gary Habermas. He is probably the world's leading expert on the resurrection. If I had to guess, I'd say he's probably studied in terms of time the resurrection more than anybody who's ever lived. He's in the process right now of publishing a 4-volume defense of the resurrection. What it is, why it's true, and what it means. Volume 1 came out last year, and it's actually 1,100 pages, 5 pounds. I bought 2 of them just to work out. I was like, I'm lifting with these bad boys. Volume 2, Volume 3, I think Volume 4 comes out maybe in May. What's interesting about Gary is he started collecting. He did his PhD in 1976 at Michigan State University on it's called The Resurrection of Jesus, a Rational Inquiry. If you're going to defend something like the resurrection at a public, respectable institution like Michigan State, and you have people that sign your doctoral degree with their names who aren't Christians, you're going to have to make a pretty legitimate, solid research case. Wrote that in 76, the year I was born, just for the record. Went through a period of serious doubt in his life. Almost became a Buddhist for about a decade. And that poured him to go back and study it even more, hence this recent 4-volume set. When I had a chance to interview him, I said, Gary, if you had not gone through that much doubt, would have you have been motivated to research so much? And I kind of paused and said, you know what? I wouldn't have. Isn't it amazing that God can use our weaknesses for his good? Well, one of the things, he has a unique way of defending the resurrection. He says there's these certain facts, calls them minimal facts, that the majority of scholars agree on. And he's right. From the left to the right, the majority of scholars, for example, believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. It is far too confirmed in history to be doubted. One, we have multiple Christian sources in the Bible. We have sources outside of the Bible that are Christian. We have Tacitus and Josephus, Roman and Jew early, who confirm this. But also, if you're inventing a story about somebody who you want to be your savior, crucifixion was the most shameful, dishonorable death imaginable. You wouldn't invent that fate for your hero. We know Jesus died by crucifixion. But second, the disciples reported experiences with Jesus they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. So we have multiple early reports from the disciples themselves that they believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Third, Saul became a follower of Jesus after having an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. So Saul is important because if you come up with any explanation to account for all the disciples, well, you also need an explanation for Saul, because he wasn't one. We know from Acts, early chapters, he is persecuting, like Acts 9 at the death of, why did my mind go blank? Stephen, like I said, very slowly. At the death of Stephen, he is persecuting Christians. And fourth, the tomb of Jesus was found empty shortly after his death. Now, there's other facts that he gives, like the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, who was not one of the 12. And so what he argues is that any explanation for the origin of the Christian way has to account for these different facts. And I think he's right that any explanation that's naturalistic can account for some of them, but not all of them. So like hallucinations, in principle, could account for the appearances, say the disciples, but you also have to get Paul, who's in a very different emotional state, and then what about the empty tomb? So some explanations, some would say, oh, they took the body of Jesus and they moved it. Okay, maybe you get an empty tomb, but how to explain the conversion of Paul? How to explain the reports that they had seen the risen Jesus? His argument is that there's only one explanation that accounts for all the facts, and it's that Jesus has actually risen from the grave. And I think he's right about this. I think he's right about it. The resurrection confirms Jesus as God's unique revelation in history. So from the beginning and fine-tune of the universe, to the origin of life and consciousness, to the existence of the moral law, from modern-day miracles to the historical evidence Jesus has risen, God is back. Thoughts, questions, challenges, clarification. We've got a few minutes. Go. I see two right here. We'll start with you right up here, and if you want to sneak in the back so we can go straight to her.
I want to circle back to the moral law.
Mm-hmm.
And I may be giving a ignorant summation of Jordan Peterson's argument, so I'll just put that out there. So what I understand is that Jordan Peterson wrote this book, and he talks about different moral laws. The Judeo-Christian ethic is one. And I think what I understood was his claim is that we as human beings evolved and created a moral law because it's part of, what's that word he uses? It's good for humanity, right? Because we want to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes to the conclusion that the Judeo-Christian ethic is the supreme moral law and should be adopted by everyone. So we talked earlier about how this moral law is written in our hearts. And as Christians, we can understand that. But when you're talking to someone who is a Jordan Peterson follower, like worships the work he produces, and they have bought into this evolution of moral law and what he has presented, how might you help them see truth in that conversation? I just haven't been able to put the right words there.
Jordan Peterson is not a Christian. He danced around it for a while, gave hints that he was, but I think he's been sufficiently clear that he does not embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, but he's very favorable to a lot of biblical teachings. I would just press in on what I think are the inadequacies of an evolutionary account of morality. And I think there's a lot. One thing was, the way you described it, I don't know the exact language he uses, but is morality something that we have come up with, hence we came up with a Christian moral system, so we can flourish and survive? If so, it's subjective, and we're not bound to follow it unless there's some obligation we have towards the survival and flourishing of the species. Now, I think we have an obligation for the survival and flourishing of species because there's a God who placed us here and commands us to love one another. But in a universe without God, where does that obligation come from? And he's assuming it within his system. Sam Harris does the same thing. He says if we can just assume what's so obvious that we should operate towards our survival and flourishing, then science can answer us with morality. I said, you're right if we assume that. But that starting point is not built within your system. You have to pull it from somewhere else. which tells me the system itself is inadequate. So I would push in on the weaknesses of an evolutionary morality and talk about, do you really think it's good that we sacrifice for the poor? Because he talks about sacrifice all the time. Is that an objective moral good? Or is that just something evolution has wired into us? Because if evolution has wired us into it, I can do it or I can choose not to do it. I haven't violated any moral law. But you sure speak about it as if we ought to do that. That's where I would push back. You know, C.S. Lewis said evolution in principle could explain why we have instincts, but you have good instincts and you have bad instincts, right? Good instincts hurt somebody, bad instincts help somebody. Well, I need some law to adjudicate between those instincts to tell me which one I should actually follow. That can't come from evolution itself. That has to come from something outside of it. That's where I would go with Peterson. Did I see one back there? Are your hands? Oh, right there with the glasses on the right. Her hand was up at the beginning. There you go. Good job.
Thank you. Talking about how God is back in our culture, we are seeing, and it is backed by Barna's studies, that more men are engaging in church, and so I guess my question would be, do you believe that it's because of moral law is becoming more logical or more available that men are coming back to the church, other than, obviously it's a move of the spirit?
Sure. Here's what I think. It is an interesting shift, because I remember 90s, early 2000s, it's like the church is being feminized, women are going to church, men are not. And we've kind of seen this shift, where with Gen Zers and millennials, the shift of women towards progressivism and men towards a little bit more conservative positions. I think one of the factors is I think a lot of men, in particular white men, have felt like they're told, you're the problem of the world, you're the victim. They felt beat up on and just have been alienated by this and realize the bankruptcy of it. And sadly, some of them are like drawn towards Nick Fuentes and his, what he calls himself a Catholic, but racist, white supremacist nonsense. And some are coming back to church. So I think it's a disillusionment with identity politics. And so a lot of people feeling like, wait a minute, I'm the problem of the world just because I exist? And some would say it's reverse racism. I'm not entering into the ethics and debate about that. I'm saying that's how I think a lot of young men feel. And thus there's an openness and an interest in spiritual things and a very reactionary movement against that. Some go further into identity politics. Some are like, I want to find meaning in the church and God.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question about morality, and also has almost like a two-part question. The general concept of there are certain words we use that have two different meanings. When Sam Harris talks about goodness, he may be talking about good tactical moves for human beings, like a good chess move, but good can also refer to morality. Could you speak to the use of the word good in these two different ways, and that also the need for us as a church to learn to speak with clarity about these things? It's not easy. You know what I mean?
It's such an intuitive and a great setup. So Sam Harris, outspoken atheist, wrote a book called The Moral Landscape. And he argues that science can give us morality. Now, in some ways, science can help adjudicate what behavior will help us grow as a population. You could do a scientific analysis of economics. What's going to help us flourish more? So science can help us in that regard, but that's still not moral. That's still about survival. That's about flourishing, but there's still no moral component whether we should do those things and whether those very behavior are right and wrong, good or evil. And so the point being, he talks about morality as objective, But he means it's objective, like science can see what behavior helps us better survive. That's different than objectively lying itself is wrong. That is a moral commandment. So your example is a good one. When Sam Harris debated William Lane Craig is like, you're using objective and you're using good like we do tennis. There's a difference between saying you're a good tennis player and you're a good person. A good tennis player is somebody who knows the skills and can serve well and return and win games. That's not a moral question. A good person, now we're talking about virtue. Now we're talking about character. Now we're in the realm of morality. So the point being, a lot of people use good. Oh, it's good in the sense of it helps us survive, it helps us flourish. But that's like playing the game of tennis. Why do I have to play the game of tennis? If I don't want to play the game of tennis, I don't have to play tennis. I can play pickleball. Well, why do I have to play the game of caring about your flourishing and caring about humanity's survival? And if somebody says, well, you can't survive if you don't, that's not a moral reason. That's a selfish, prudential reason. And it doesn't ground it in the way you're describing. So bottom line, distinguishing terms, just asking questions is the one thing I would say we're back to. If somebody says, like, science can give us objective morality, can you tell me what you mean by objective morality? Science can help us know what it means to be a good person. What do you mean by a good person? What do you mean by science? Questions, questions, questions. Listen well to somebody's assumptions and ask thoughtful questions is the way to get at it. And the distinction you brought up is really important and timely and helpful. Good. Let's do one more in the back.
I'm going to step away because I'm really loud. Anyway, first of all, we'll talk miracles. Don't forget, as Christians, the Holy Spirit does amazing things all the time.
Amen.
But I want to ask, we can talk to many people about many things, but when people are good, how do you talk to just, somebody that lives probably sometimes better than Christians do? How do you talk to them about Christ when, their life is good? Does that make sense?
I think so. Well, keep something in mind. My question is not so much how good of a life somebody lives, but how good of a life they think that they live. Because nobody lives a good life. Read Romans 3, no one is good, no, not one. Now, some of us might live better moral lives than others, sure, and there's probably some non-Christians who live better moral lives than Christians. My question is, how open is this person? So the rich young ruler, Jesus let him walk away because he wasn't really open. I can't force anybody to be open who's not. I can try to ask questions. I can challenge their thinking. You can take the Ray Comfort approach and say, okay, you think you're good. Let's walk down the list. Have you ever told a lie? That makes you a liar. Have you ever told, you ever stole something? That makes you a thief. If we take God's standard, how are you doing? Like, that's a way to do that with somebody who thinks they're good in their own mind. If they're ultimately not open, I'm going to pray for that person. I'm going to try to live out a life in front of them and be the kind of person that when they go through difficulty in their life or are aware of their moral failure, they will come to me. That's my hope and prayer. All right, it's 1:40. We're going to start sharp at 1:50. Take 10 minutes, and we're going to pivot to the question of transgender. And I want you to see, we've talked about worldview, why truth matters, a case for the Christian worldview, and now we're going to kind of apply it to an issue of our day more practically, and you'll see some of what we've talked about really bleed into this. Go to the bathroom, get some coffee, get another donut. We're starting sharp in 9 minutes at 1:50 for our final session.